In the chaos of gunfire and screaming, when trained soldiers froze and seasoned officers hesitated, it was the quiet woman in scrubs who stepped forward. The same woman they had dismissed as just a nurse for 3 years. The same woman whose tactical suggestions were politely ignored in briefings. The same woman who had been watching, learning, and preparing for a moment like this. Sarah Chen had always known that being underestimated could be her greatest weapon. She just never imagined it would save 37 lives in a single afternoon. This is the story of how a small-town nurse from Oregon became the most unlikely hero of a military compound under siege, proving that courage doesn't wear rank insignia and wisdom doesn't require a uniform. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, waiting for their moment to show the world who they really are. Sarah Chen arrived at Forward Operating Base Phoenix on a Tuesday morning in March, carrying 2 duffel bags and a determination that nobody bothered to notice. The military transport helicopter kicked up clouds of desert sand as it touched down, and she squinted through the dust storm, taking her first look at what would be her home for the next 2 years. The base sprawled across the rocky terrain like a small metal city, surrounded by high concrete walls topped with razor wire. Guard towers rose at each corner, their dark silhouettes stark against the pale morning sky. Sarah counted 12 buildings within the perimeter, from the command center with its forest of radio antennas to the low-slung medical facility that would be her domain. As she walked across the compound with her escort, Corporal Martinez, Sarah noticed everything. The defensive positions were well placed but undermanned. The motor pool sat too close to the fuel depot, a tactical vulnerability that made her military father's voice echo in her head. The sightlines from the guard towers had blind spots near the eastern wall where supply trucks entered. These observations would prove crucial later, but for now, she filed them away silently. "Welcome to paradise," Martinez said with a grin that didn't quite hide his exhaustion. "Doc Peterson is waiting for you in the medical bay. Fair warning, though, he's been pulling double shifts since our last nurse rotated out 3 weeks ago." "Doctor." James Peterson looked exactly like Sarah had imagined from their phone conversations, tall and angular with graying temples and the careful posture of a man who had seen too much. He greeted her with genuine relief and launched immediately into the tour of their medical facility. The infirmary was larger than she had expected, with 12 beds, a small surgery suite, and a pharmacy stocked with everything from battlefield trauma supplies to routine medications. Peterson explained their typical caseload, everything from combat injuries to heat exhaustion to the occasional appendectomy. What he didn't mention, but Sarah quickly observed, was how isolated they were from major medical facilities and how much their small team would need to handle on their own. "Most of the guys here think nurses are just doctor's assistants," Peterson said as they finished the tour. "They don't understand that a good nurse often knows more about keeping people alive than half the officers on this base. I have a feeling you're going to surprise them." Sarah simply nodded, not mentioning that surprising people had been her specialty long before she ever picked up a stethoscope. Growing up as the daughter of Colonel Robert Chen, Sarah had been raised on military strategy the way other children learn nursery rhymes. Her father had been a tactical genius, one of the Army's most respected strategic planners before his retirement. During family dinners, instead of discussing school gossip or television shows, they analyzed historical battles and discussed defensive positioning. Her mother, Dr. Linda Chen, was a trauma surgeon who had served 3 tours in Iraq before settling into civilian practice. From her, Sarah learned that healing and fighting were often the same thing, just approached from different angles. Medicine under pressure wasn't about having perfect conditions. It was about working with what you had and never giving up. When Sarah announced her intention to join the military as a nurse rather than pursuing medical school like her parents expected, the dinner table discussions became more intense. Her father drilled her on everything from small unit tactics to resource management. Her mother taught her advanced trauma procedures that went far beyond standard nursing training. "If you're going to do this," her father had said during one particularly memorable evening, "you need to understand that being a nurse in a combat zone means being a soldier who happens to specialize in keeping people alive. The enemy won't care about your Red Cross patches." Those lessons served her well in her first assignment in Afghanistan, where she had earned a reputation for staying calm under pressure and thinking 3 steps ahead of every crisis. But that assignment had been at a large base, with hundreds of personnel and multiple support systems. FOB Phoenix was different, smaller and more isolated, with just 47 people responsible for maintaining security in a region that had seen increasing insurgent activity. Her first week passed quietly as she settled into the rhythm of base life. Morning medical call brought the usual minor complaints: scraped knuckles from maintenance work, a bout of food poisoning from someone who had ignored the warnings about local water, and the persistent back problems that plagued anyone who spent their days carrying heavy equipment in desert heat. Sarah quickly established her routines, but she also began something that would set her apart from previous medical personnel. During her off-duty hours, she walked the perimeter of the base, memorizing the layout, understanding the defensive preparations, and observing the daily patterns of personnel movement. She noticed that the guards changed shifts with mathematical precision every 6 hours, but there was a brief moment during each transition when certain areas were less carefully watched. She observed that supply convoys arrived on Tuesdays and Fridays, always between 0800 and 1000 hours. She noted which personnel carried sidearms and which relied on the security of others. Most importantly, she began attending the evening briefings that most medical personnel skipped. Captain Rodriguez, the base commander, initially seemed surprised to see her there, but he didn't object when she quietly took a seat in the back of the room. These briefings painted a picture of a region under increasing pressure. Intelligence reports suggested that insurgent groups were becoming more organized and better equipped. Local informants spoke of foreign fighters moving through the area, bringing expertise in advanced weapons. The frequency of probing attacks on isolated outposts had increased by 30% over the past month. "They're testing us," Major Williams, the intelligence officer, explained during one briefing. "Small groups, hit-and-run tactics, trying to find weaknesses in our defensive perimeter and response protocols." Sarah listened to these reports with the analytical mind her father had trained and the practical perspective her mother had instilled. She began to see patterns that others missed, connections between seemingly unrelated incidents that suggested a larger strategy at work. The insurgents weren't just conducting random attacks. They were systematically gathering intelligence about base operations. The timing of recent probes corresponded with supply deliveries and shift changes. Someone was watching FOB Phoenix very carefully, learning their routines and preparing for something bigger. She tried to share these observations during one of the briefings, raising her hand tentatively when Major Williams asked for questions or comments. "I've been reviewing the timing of recent incidents," she began, "and there seems to be a correlation with our logistical operations that might indicate—" "Thank you, Nurse Chen." Captain Rodriguez interrupted politely but firmly. "We appreciate your perspective, but intelligence analysis is handled by trained specialists." The dismissal was gentle but clear. She was medical personnel, not a strategist. Her job was to patch up wounded soldiers, not to analyze enemy tactics. The message was received by everyone in the room, and Sarah returned to her quiet observation without further comment. But she didn't stop watching, and she didn't stop thinking. Dr. Peterson noticed her intensity during their daily work together. "You're different from the other nurses we've had here," he commented one afternoon as they restocked medical supplies. "More alert, like you're always expecting something to happen." "In my experience," Sarah replied, checking the inventory of surgical instruments, "something usually is about to happen. The question is whether you're ready for it when it does." That readiness would be tested sooner than either of them imagined. The base settled into its evening routine as Sarah completed her shift on a Thursday in late April. The temperature had dropped from the crushing heat of afternoon to merely uncomfortable, and personnel moved with the slower pace of people looking forward to rest. Guard towers were manned, perimeter patrols had checked in, and the kitchen staff was preparing the evening meal. Sarah was completing paperwork in the medical facility when she heard the first unusual sound. A distant rumble that didn't match the familiar patterns of their own vehicles or the aircraft that occasionally passed overhead. She paused, listening carefully, her father's training, automatically cataloging and analyzing the audio signature. Multiple vehicles, moving slowly, approaching from the east. Not the scheduled supply convoy which had already arrived and departed that morning. Not the patrol that was still 2 hours from return. Something else entirely. She walked to the window and looked toward the eastern gate, but the angle was wrong to see the approach road clearly. The sound grew closer, and she realized with growing alarm that it had stopped just outside the range of their perimeter sensors. That's when the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing everything in the red glow that meant the base was switching to backup power. Sarah heard shouts from the guard towers and the rapid footsteps of personnel responding to alerts. Then the mortars started falling. The first explosion shook the medical building, rattling instruments and sending equipment tumbling from shelves. Sarah dropped to the floor instinctively, her mind already shifting into crisis mode. Through the window she could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions around the perimeter as the base's defensive weapons began returning fire. This wasn't a probing attack or a hit-and-run raid. This was a coordinated assault, precisely timed and professionally executed. Everything she had observed over the past month suddenly made terrible sense. The insurgents hadn't been conducting random tests of their defenses. They had been preparing for this moment. As another mortar round exploded closer to the medical facility, Sarah crawled toward the communications equipment. She needed to contact Peterson, who was off duty in his quarters, and begin preparing for casualties. But as she reached for the radio, she realized that the attack had been planned with one crucial element in mind. The enemy knew exactly how FOB Phoenix would respond to an assault because they had been watching and learning for weeks. They knew the defensive positions, the response protocols, and the location of every critical facility on the base, including the medical facility where she was now trapped. The battle for FOB Phoenix had begun, and Sarah Chen was about to discover that all her father's lessons about military strategy and her mother's training in trauma medicine were about to be tested in ways neither of them had ever imagined. In the red glow of emergency lighting, with explosions shaking the building around her, she began to realize that being underestimated was about to become the base's only advantage. Because while the enemy had studied their defensive plans and personnel assignments, they had made one critical error in their intelligence gathering. They had dismissed the quiet nurse as irrelevant to military operations. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The second mortar round hit the communications building, and Sarah watched through the medical facility window as sparks erupted from the damaged antenna array. The steady chatter of radio traffic that normally provided the background soundtrack of base operations went silent, replaced by the irregular crackle of small arms fire and shouted orders that grew increasingly desperate. Sarah crawled across the medical bay floor, staying low as fragments of concrete showered down from the ceiling where shrapnel had punched through. She reached the emergency medical kit and began pulling supplies, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the chaos around her. Trauma bandages, morphine, surgical clamps, everything she would need when the wounded started arriving. Because they would start arriving. That was the grim mathematics of combat that her mother had taught her during those long discussions about battlefield medicine. Every explosion, every burst of gunfire, every tactical mistake translated into human bodies that would need immediate care to survive. The door burst open, and Corporal Martinez stumbled inside, blood streaming down the left side of his face from a scalp wound. Behind him, two more soldiers carried a third between them, his leg twisted at an angle that made Sarah's stomach clench. "Doc Peterson?" Martinez gasped, pressing a makeshift bandage against his head. "In his quarters when the attack started," Sarah replied, already moving toward the severely wounded soldier. "Help me get him on the table." The soldier with the broken leg was barely conscious, his face gray with shock and pain. Sarah quickly assessed his condition while Martinez and the others watched. Compound fracture of the left tibia, significant blood loss, possible internal injuries from the blast that had thrown him against a concrete barrier. "I need to stabilize him before shock sets in completely," she said, more to herself than to the others. "Martinez, can you still function with that head wound?" "It's just a scratch," he replied, though the steady flow of blood suggested otherwise. "Sit down and let me look at it in a minute." "You two," she addressed the soldiers who had carried their wounded comrade, "what's the tactical situation outside?" The question surprised them. Nurses weren't supposed to ask about tactical situations. They were supposed to focus on medical issues and let the soldiers handle the fighting. But there was something in Sarah's voice, an authority that made them respond automatically. "They hit us from three sides simultaneously," the older soldier, Sergeant Kim, reported. "Mortars, RPGs, small arms. Took out communications first thing, then the power grid. Captain Rodriguez is trying to coordinate defense from the command bunker, but we can't reach the guard towers." Sarah processed this information while her hands continued working on the wounded soldier's leg. The attack pattern confirmed her earlier analysis. This wasn't random violence. It was a carefully planned operation, designed to isolate the base and prevent effective communication between defensive positions. "How many attackers?" she asked, applying a pressure bandage to slow the bleeding. "Unknown. Major Williams estimates between 30 and 50, but they're using the terrain to mask their actual numbers. Could be more. 50 attackers against 47 defenders, assuming everyone on the base was still alive and functional. Not impossible odds, but challenging, especially if the attackers had the initiative and better knowledge of the base layout." Another explosion, closer this time, shook the building violently. The lights flickered, and Sarah realized that the backup generator was taking damage. If they lost power completely, performing any kind of surgery would become nearly impossible. "I need you to get Dr. Peterson," she told Martinez. "His quarters are in Building C. Stay low, use the covered walkway, and be careful. The enemy seems to know our layout pretty well." Martinez nodded and headed for the door, then paused. What if Peterson is... What if he can't make it back? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Then you come back anyway, and we do what we can with what we have.
As Martinez disappeared into the night, Sarah continued working on her patient.
The soldier's blood pressure was dropping, and she could see the early signs of hypovolemic shock setting in. In a fully equipped hospital with a complete surgical team, this would be a challenging but routine procedure. Here, under fire, with limited supplies and no way to call for medevac, it became a desperate race against time. Sergeant Kim, she called out, I need you to assist me. Wash your hands thoroughly and put on gloves from that box. Ma'am, I'm not medical personnel. Right now, you're whatever I need you to be, Sarah interrupted firmly. This soldier will die if I can't get his bleeding under control, and I can't do it alone. Are you willing to help save his life? Kim nodded and moved to the sink, following Sarah's rapid instructions on sterile procedure. Within minutes, he was holding instruments and monitoring vital signs while Sarah worked to repair the damaged blood vessels in the soldier's leg. As she worked, Sarah's mind continued processing the tactical situation outside. The initial barrage had lasted approximately 12 minutes, suggesting the attackers had limited mortar ammunition and were conserving it for specific targets. The shift to small arms fire indicated they were moving to the second phase of their assault, probably attempting to breach the perimeter at predetermined weak points. The base's defensive plan, which she had studied during those evening briefings, called for concentrated fire from the guard towers, while patrols moved to reinforce threatened sections of the perimeter. But that plan assumed functional communications and coordinated movement between units. With the communication system down and personnel scattered by the initial bombardment, the defenders were effectively fighting as isolated groups rather than a unified force. The medical facility door opened again, and Sarah looked up hopefully, expecting to see Peterson. Instead, Captain Rodriguez stumbled inside, his uniform torn and blackened with smoke. Blood seeped through a makeshift bandage around his left arm, and his face showed the strain of a commander whose carefully planned defensive positions were falling apart around him. Nurse Chen, he said, breathing heavily. How many casualties do we have here? 2 so far, Sarah replied without stopping her work on the soldier's leg. But Captain, we have bigger problems than casualties. Rodriguez looked surprised by her directness. What do you mean? The attackers knew exactly when and where to hit us. They took out communications first, then power, then started targeting specific buildings in sequence. This isn't a random raid. Someone gave them detailed intelligence about our defensive plans. The captain stared at her, clearly struggling to process the implications. Are you suggesting we have a security breach? I'm suggesting that whoever planned this attack knows our standard response protocols, Sarah replied, tying off a suture. They know where our defensive positions are, how we communicate, and probably how many personnel we have in each location. Another burst of automatic weapons fire rattled the windows, punctuated by the deeper boom of an RPG explosion somewhere near the motor pool. Rodriguez instinctively ducked, then looked at Sarah with a new expression of uncertainty. What do you recommend? He asked, and Sarah realized this was the first time any officer on the base had asked for her tactical opinion. We need to abandon the standard defensive plan, she said immediately. If they know what we're supposed to do, we need to do something else. Something unexpected. Such as? Sarah paused in her work, considering the problem from multiple angles simultaneously. Her patient was stable for the moment, Sergeant Kim was competently monitoring his vital signs, and Captain Rodriguez was actually listening to her suggestions. For the first time since arriving at FOB Phoenix, she had an opportunity to apply everything her father had taught her about military strategy. The attackers are expecting us to defend from fixed positions, she explained. Guard towers, perimeter bunkers, predetermined fields of fire. But those positions are also known to them, which means they've probably pre-sighted their weapons and know exactly how to neutralize each one. So what alternative do we have?
Mobile defense.
Small teams, moving between positions, attacking from unexpected angles, make them react to us instead of following their predetermined plan. Rodriguez considered this, but Sarah could see the doubt in his expression. That's not how we train for base defense. Our people know the standard protocols. Captain, Sarah interrupted gently but firmly, our people are dying because the enemy knows our standard protocols. We can't fight this battle the way we planned to fight it because the enemy planned for that too. The lights flickered again and this time they stayed off. Emergency lighting cast everything in red shadows, and Sarah realized they had just lost the backup generator. Outside, the sound of gunfire was getting closer to the medical facility. There's something else, Sarah continued. working now by the dim glow of emergency lighting. If the attackers know our defensive plans this well, they probably also know about the medical facility. They'll target it eventually, either to eliminate our ability to treat wounded or to capture medical supplies and personnel. Rodriguez looked around the medical bay as if seeing it for the first time as a tactical vulnerability rather than a place of healing. What do you suggest we do about that? We evacuate the wounded to a more secure location and prepare to abandon this building if necessary. But first, we need to get Dr.
Peterson back here safely, and we need to establish some kind of communication with the other defensive positions.
As if summoned by her words, Martinez appeared in the doorway again, supporting a limping Dr. Roosevelt.
Peterson. The older man's face was pale, and Sarah could see that his left leg was injured, but he was conscious and alert. Sorry I'm late to the party, Peterson said with a weak smile. Took some shrapnel in the leg when they hit Building C. Martinez here kept me from bleeding out on the way over. Sarah quickly examined Peterson's wound while updating him on their current patients and the tactical situation. The shrapnel wound was painful but not life-threatening, and Peterson was able to function despite the injury. So, Peterson said after she finished her assessment, "What's our next move, Nurse Chen?" The question surprised her not just because Peterson was asking for her tactical opinion, but because she realized she had become the de facto coordinator for their small group. Captain Rodriguez, despite his rank and training, was looking to her for leadership in this crisis. "We need to move our patients to a more defensible location," she said. "The attackers will target this building eventually, and we can't properly defend it. We also need to find a way to coordinate with the other survivors and implement a more flexible defensive strategy." "Where do you suggest we move the wounded?" Rodriguez asked. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, visualizing the layout of the base and considering the tactical requirements. They needed a location that was defensible but not obvious, with multiple exit routes and some protection from direct fire. "The maintenance bunker," she said finally. "It's underground, has reinforced concrete walls, and connects to the utility tunnels that run under most of the base. If we position ourselves there, we can move supplies and personnel without exposing them to direct fire." Peterson nodded approvingly. "The bunker also has its own communication equipment, separate from the main system. If that's still functional, we might be able to contact the outside world. More importantly," Sarah added, "we can use the utility tunnels to coordinate counterattacks. The enemy expects us to be trapped in our defensive positions, but if we can move unseen between buildings, we can hit them from directions they're not covering." Captain Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah realized he was struggling with the fundamental shift from viewing her as medical support personnel to recognizing her as a tactical asset. "Nurse Chen," he said finally, "I'm beginning to think we've been seriously underestimating you."
"That's okay, Captain," Sarah replied, beginning to prepare their wounded for transport.
The enemy made the same mistake. As they worked together to stabilize their patients for movement, Sarah felt a familiar calm settling over her. This was the moment her parents had been preparing her for, when medical training and tactical knowledge would need to work together to save lives. The base was under attack, communications were down, and they were outnumbered by an enemy that seemed to know their every move. But they had one advantage the attackers hadn't counted on. They had someone who had been watching, learning, and preparing for exactly this kind of crisis. Someone who understood that the best defense wasn't always the strongest position, but the most unexpected one. Someone who had spent her entire life being underestimated and had learned to turn that disadvantage into a weapon. The battle for FOB Phoenix was far from over, but Sarah Chen was just getting started. Moving 2 critically wounded soldiers through a combat zone while under enemy fire required the kind of desperate improvisation that no training manual could adequately prepare someone for. Sarah rigged a makeshift stretcher from medical equipment and canvas tarps, while Peterson worked to ensure their patients could survive the transport. The soldier with the compound leg fracture was unconscious but stable, while Martinez continued to function despite his head wound, though Sarah could see he was fighting waves of dizziness. Captain Rodriguez positioned himself at the medical facility's door, scanning the area between buildings for enemy movement. The sporadic gunfire that had characterized the first phase of the attack was now more organized and directed, suggesting the attackers were consolidating their positions and preparing for the next stage of their assault. "I count at least 3 separate firing positions along the eastern perimeter," Rodriguez reported quietly. "They've got overlapping fields of fire covering the main routes between buildings. Getting to the maintenance bunker is going to be complicated." Sarah joined him at the door, studying the terrain with eyes trained by years of listening to her father's tactical discussions. The maintenance bunker was approximately 200 meters away, across open ground that was now swept by enemy fire. The direct route would be suicide, but there were alternatives if you knew where to look.
The utility trenches, she said, pointing to a series of concrete channels that ran between buildings to carry electrical cables and water pipes. They're deep enough to provide cover if we stay low, and they connect directly to the bunker access tunnel. Peterson looked doubtful.
Those trenches are barely 3 feet deep, and they're not designed for people. They're better than crossing open ground under fire, Sarah replied. Besides, the enemy won't expect us to use service infrastructure for tactical movement. They'll be watching the normal routes between buildings. Rodriguez considered this, then nodded. It's worth a try.
How do we get the wounded through spaces that narrow? Sarah had already worked out the logistics. We break down into 2 groups. You and Martinez take point, clear the route and establish security at the bunker.
Peterson and I follow with the wounded, using the stretchers to drag them through the trenches. That leaves you exposed if the enemy spots you, Rodriguez pointed out. Only for the final approach to the bunker entrance, Sarah replied, and by then you'll be in position to provide covering fire. As they prepared to move, Sarah felt the familiar heightening of awareness that came with extreme danger. Every sound became significant, every shadow potentially concealing an enemy position. But underneath the natural fear was something else, a growing confidence in her ability to think clearly under pressure and make decisions that others would rely on. The first part of their movement went smoothly. Rodriguez and Martinez disappeared into the utility trench and began working their way toward the maintenance bunker, while Sarah and Peterson prepared their patients for transport. The unconscious soldier with the leg injury was relatively easy to manage, but the second soldier was beginning to show signs of internal bleeding that required immediate attention.
We're running out of time with this one, Peterson said quietly, checking the soldier's pulse and finding it rapid and weak. If we don't get him to a proper surgical setup soon. The maintenance bunker has emergency medical supplies, Sarah replied, though she wasn't entirely sure what condition those supplies would be in.
We'll make do with what we have. A burst of automatic weapons fire erupted from somewhere near the command center, followed by the distinctive whump of an RPG explosion. Through the medical facility windows, Sarah could see the glow of fires starting in multiple buildings around the base. The attackers were no longer content to simply suppress the defenders. They were beginning to destroy the infrastructure systematically. Rodriguez's voice came through the portable radio Sarah had grabbed from the medical bay. We're at the bunker. Route is clear, but we've got enemy movement about 50 meters east of your position. You need to move now before they establish a position that overlooks the trenches. Sarah and Peterson began the awkward process of maneuvering their patients through the utility access. The concrete trenches were indeed narrow, designed for cables and pipes rather than people, and dragging wounded soldiers through them required careful coordination to avoid causing additional injuries. The unconscious soldier presented the biggest challenge. His broken leg made it difficult to position him in the stretcher, and every movement risked additional damage to the already compromised limb. Sarah found herself drawing on techniques her mother had demonstrated years earlier, ways to immobilize and transport trauma victims when proper equipment wasn't available. As they worked their way through the underground route, Sarah could hear the battle continuing above them. The sound of gunfire was becoming more sporadic, which worried her more than continuous shooting would have. Sporadic fire suggested that one side or the other was gaining a decisive advantage, and given the careful planning evident in the initial attack, she suspected it wasn't the defenders. Almost there, Peterson whispered, breathing heavily from the exertion of dragging equipment and wounded through the narrow space. I can see the bunker access tunnel ahead. They emerged into the maintenance bunker to find Rodriguez and Martinez setting up a defensive perimeter around the entrance. The bunker itself was larger than Sarah had expected, with concrete walls 3 feet thick, and a ceiling reinforced with steel beams. Emergency lighting cast everything in harsh shadows, but the space felt secure in a way that the medical facility never had. More importantly, the communication equipment Peterson had mentioned was not only functional, but already crackling with radio traffic from other survivor groups around the base. Nurse Chen, Rodriguez called her over to the radio setup. You need to hear this. The radio conversations painted a grim picture of the base's defensive situation. The guard towers had been neutralized early in the attack, cutting off the high ground observation that would normally coordinate defensive fire. The command center was still functional, but effectively isolated, unable to communicate with or support the scattered groups of defenders. Most disturbing was the intelligence coming from Sergeant Williams in the communications bunker. The enemy had somehow acquired detailed maps of the base layout, including the locations of defensive positions, supply depots, and personnel quarters. They were moving with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going and what they would find there. It's like they had someone draw them a blueprint, Williams reported over the radio. They hit every critical system in the exact sequence that would cause maximum disruption. Sarah listened to these reports while setting up a makeshift medical station in the corner of the bunker. The supplies here were basic but functional, enough to stabilize their current patients and treat additional casualties if necessary. But her mind was working on a larger problem, the tactical situation that was rapidly deteriorating around them. "Captain Rodriguez?" she said, moving away from the wounded soldiers so they wouldn't hear. "We need to discuss the bigger picture here." Rodriguez joined her, along with Peterson and Martinez, forming an impromptu command group that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The idea of a nurse providing strategic advice to a base commander violated every protocol in the military handbook. But normal circumstances had ceased to exist the moment the first mortar round exploded. "What are you thinking?" Rodriguez asked. "The enemy has two significant advantages," Sarah began, organizing her thoughts in the systematic way her father had taught her. "Superior intelligence about our defensive preparations, and the initiative that comes from careful planning. We can't do anything about the intelligence breach now, but we can neutralize their initiative by doing something they haven't planned for."
Such as aggressive counterattack. They expect us to hunker down in defensive positions and wait for relief.
"Instead, we coordinate with the other survivor groups and hit them while they're still in their assault positions." Peterson looked skeptical. "We're outnumbered and outgunned. How do you propose we mount an effective counterattack?" Sarah moved to a map of the base that was mounted on the bunker wall, studying the layout with new eyes. The utility tunnel system connects most of the major buildings on the base. If we can use those tunnels to move personnel without being detected, we can coordinate simultaneous attacks from multiple positions. "The tunnels aren't designed for tactical movement," Martinez pointed out, wincing as he adjusted the bandage on his head wound. "No, but they're also not being watched by the enemy," Sarah replied. "They know our defensive positions and our normal movement routes, but they don't know about maintenance infrastructure. We can use that blind spot to our advantage." Rodriguez studied the map, following the tunnel routes with his finger. "Even if we could coordinate movement through the tunnels, we still have the problem of limited ammunition and no way to call for backup." "Actually," Sarah said, pointing to a section of the map near the eastern perimeter, "we might have more resources available than we think. The enemy had to get their heavy weapons somewhere close to the base to conduct this attack. RPGs, mortars, the equipment for the jamming system that's blocking our communications. All of that hardware is probably positioned just outside our perimeter." The implications of this observation settled over the group slowly. If they could locate and capture the enemy's weapon positions, they would not only eliminate the threat but also acquire additional firepower for their own use. "That's assuming we can get close enough to those positions without being detected," Peterson said. "The utility tunnels extend beyond the base perimeter," Sarah replied, indicating the routes on the map. "They connect to the civilian water treatment facility about half a mile east. If we can reach that facility, we can approach the enemy positions from behind while they're focused on the base." Rodriguez was quiet for several minutes, studying the map and considering the tactical possibilities. Sarah could see him struggling with the fundamental question of whether to trust a plan developed by someone with no formal military command experience. "There's something else to consider," she added quietly. "The enemy's attack plan was based on intelligence about our normal defensive procedures. But they couldn't have anticipated that we would abandon standard protocols and start thinking creatively about unconventional tactics. The more we deviate from their expectations, the more we disrupt their operational plan." "You're talking about a complete reversal of our defensive strategy," Rodriguez said finally. "Yes, I am. Because our original defensive strategy was compromised before the first shot was fired." The radio crackled with another transmission from Sergeant Williams. "All stations, be advised that enemy forces are beginning to move closer to remaining defensive positions. Estimate 20 to 30 minutes before they're in position to overrun isolated strongpoints." Sarah met Rodriguez's gaze steadily. "Captain, we can't wait for someone else to rescue us. We have to rescue ourselves, and we have to do it in a way that the enemy doesn't expect." Rodriguez nodded slowly, then reached for the radio microphone. "All stations, this is Phoenix 6. We're implementing Emergency Protocol 77 Alpha. All units maintain position, but prepare for coordinated movement on my signal." Emergency Protocol 77 Alpha was the code designation for unconventional warfare tactics, a set of procedures that most personnel hoped they would never need to use. It authorized small unit operations outside normal command structure, and gave individual teams considerable tactical flexibility. As Rodriguez began coordinating with the other survivor groups, Sarah realized that she had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She was no longer just a nurse who happened to understand military strategy. She had become an active participant in the tactical planning that would determine whether anyone on the base survived the next few hours. The transition felt natural, even inevitable. All her life, people had seen her as a caregiver first and everything else second. But caregiving and warfare shared a fundamental principle. Both required the willingness to do whatever was necessary to preserve life, regardless of how difficult or dangerous that might be. As she checked on their wounded soldiers one more time before the next phase of operations, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since the attack began. The quiet nurse who had arrived at FOB Phoenix 6 weeks ago would never have presumed to offer tactical advice to a base commander, but that person had been shaped by assumptions about roles and expectations that no longer applied. In the chaos of combat, competence mattered more than rank, and good ideas were more valuable than proper protocol. Sarah Chen had spent her entire life preparing for this moment, when the artificial boundaries between medical care and military strategy would disappear, and the only thing that mattered was keeping people alive. The enemy had made their move based on careful intelligence and detailed planning. Now it was time to show them that the most important intelligence they had missed was the determination and ingenuity of the people they had chosen to attack. The battle for FOB Phoenix was entering its most critical phase, and Sarah Chen was about to become something that no one, including herself, had ever imagined. A combat leader whose weapon was not firepower, but the kind of strategic thinking that turned apparent defeat into unexpected victory. The utility tunnel system beneath FOB Phoenix had never been intended for human traffic, let alone tactical operations. Sarah crawled through the narrow concrete channels in complete darkness, guided only by the faint glow of a red-filtered flashlight and the sound of Peterson moving ahead of her. Behind them, Martinez followed despite his head injury, carrying a backpack loaded with medical supplies and improvised explosive devices that Rodriguez had assembled from maintenance materials. Their mission was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible. While Rodriguez coordinated defensive actions from the maintenance bunker, Sarah's team was tasked with reaching the water treatment facility outside the base perimeter, locating the enemy's heavy weapons positions and neutralizing them from behind. Success would break the siege and give the surviving defenders a chance to retake their base. Failure would mean death or capture for everyone involved. The tunnels were a maze of intersecting passages, service accesses, and vertical shafts that connected the underground infrastructure to surface buildings. Sarah navigated using a hand-drawn map she had created during her weeks of base observation, marking every utility access point and maintenance route she had noticed during her evening walks around the perimeter. "Next junction, we go left," she whispered to Peterson, her voice barely audible above the distant sound of gunfire from the surface. "That should take us under the eastern wall and toward the water facility," Peterson acknowledged with a grunt, breathing heavily from the physical exertion and stress of moving through the claustrophobic underground space. He had initially questioned the wisdom of leaving their wounded soldiers in Rodriguez's care, but Sarah had convinced him that their best chance of saving lives was to eliminate the threat rather than simply treating casualties as they arrived. As they reached the junction, Sarah paused to check their progress against her mental map of the base layout. They had been moving through the tunnels for almost 30 minutes, covering approximately 400 meters of underground distance. If her calculations were correct, they should be approaching the section where the utility tunnels extended beyond the base perimeter toward the civilian infrastructure. Above them, the sounds of combat had changed character. The sporadic gunfire that had marked the siege was now punctuated by more organized volleys, suggesting that Rodriguez had succeeded in coordinating counterattacks from the surviving defensive positions. But Sarah also heard the distinctive sound of heavier weapons, mortars and RPGs, that indicated the enemy was escalating their assault in response to increased resistance. "We need to move faster," she told Peterson and Martinez. "Rodriguez is buying us time, but we can't ask him to hold off a superior force indefinitely." They pressed forward through tunnels that grew progressively older and more deteriorated as they moved away from the main base. The concrete here showed signs of age and neglect, with water stains and minor structural damage that made Sarah worry about the stability of their route. But there was no alternative. Surface movement would be impossible with enemy forces controlling the high ground around the base. The tunnel system finally opened into a larger chamber that housed the main water pumping station for the civilian facility. Emergency lighting provided enough illumination to reveal a space filled with industrial equipment, pipes, and electrical panels. More importantly, Sarah could see a metal ladder leading to a surface access hatch. "This is it," she whispered, studying the layout of the chamber and planning their next moves. "Peterson, You stay here and establish our fallback position. Martinez, you're with me. We go topside, locate the enemy weapons, and figure out how to neutralize them.
Peterson looked concerned. Sarah, you're talking about conducting a reconnaissance mission in hostile territory. You're a nurse, not a special operations soldier.
Right now, I'm whatever we need me to be, Sarah replied, echoing her earlier words to Sergeant Kim. Besides, who's more likely to be dismissed as a non-threat if we're spotted?
A male soldier or a female medical officer? The logic was sound, if depressing. Enemy forces would likely focus their attention on obvious military threats, rather than someone who appeared to be medical personnel attempting to escape or seek help.
Sarah's gender and apparent non-combatant status could provide camouflage that would be unavailable to traditional military personnel. Martinez checked his sidearm and adjusted his equipment.
What's the plan if we locate their heavy weapons positions? Improvised explosive devices, Sarah replied, indicating the backpack Martinez was carrying. Rodriguez assembled enough explosive material to disable vehicles and weapons emplacements, assuming we can get close enough to place the charges.
And if we can't get close enough, then we gather intelligence about their positions and return with that information. Rodriguez can use it to coordinate more effective defensive fire, even if we can't eliminate the threat entirely. They climbed the access ladder carefully, listening for sounds that would indicate enemy presence near the surface hatch. The metal rungs were cold and slippery, and Sarah found herself thinking about all the ways this mission could go wrong. But alongside that natural fear was a growing sense of confidence in her ability to adapt and overcome obstacles. The surface hatch opened into a small concrete structure that housed electrical controls for the water treatment facility. Through narrow windows, Sarah could see the sprawling complex of buildings and equipment that processed water for the surrounding civilian population. More importantly, she could also see the muzzle flashes and smoke that marked enemy positions approximately 200 meters toward the base.
There, Martinez whispered, pointing toward a low rise that overlooked Fob Phoenix. Mortar position.
I count at least 3 tubes, plus security personnel. Sarah studied the enemy position through a small pair of binoculars she had brought from the medical facility. The mortars were positioned behind improvised earthworks that provided protection from return fire while allowing the crews to maintain their bombardment of the base. The tactical placement was professional and well coordinated, confirming her assessment that this was a carefully planned operation rather than a spontaneous attack.
How many personnel? She asked.
Maybe 8 to 10 visible, but probably more in covered positions. And there's a communication setup that looks like it's coordinating fire missions. Sarah continued her observation, looking for patterns in the enemy's operational routine. Every few minutes, she noted, one of the mortar crews would receive radio instructions and adjust their fire to target different areas of the base. The communication discipline was impressive, suggesting these were experienced fighters rather than hastily recruited insurgents. But she also noticed something that could be exploited. The enemy's focus was entirely directed toward the base, and their security perimeter was oriented to defend against counterattacks from that direction. The approach from the water treatment facility was essentially unguarded, probably because they had determined that no significant threat could emerge from civilian infrastructure.
Can we get closer without being detected? She asked Martinez.
He studied the terrain between their position and the enemy emplacement. Maybe. There's a drainage ditch that runs most of the way there, and some scattered equipment we could use for concealment. Sarah made her decision.
We approach to within effective range, place the explosive charges, and withdraw to minimum safe distance before detonation. With luck, we can eliminate the mortar threat and disrupt their coordination before they realize what happened.
And without luck? Without luck, we improvise. The approach to the enemy position required the kind of careful movement that Sarah had never practiced but somehow understood intuitively. Every step had to be calculated to avoid detection, every pause timed to coincide with periods when enemy attention would be focused elsewhere. She found herself drawing on principles her father had discussed during their strategic conversations, lessons about patience and observation that applied equally to military tactics and medical procedures. The drainage ditch provided better concealment than she had expected, though the bottom was muddy and filled with stagnant water that soaked through their uniforms. Martinez moved ahead of her, using hand signals to indicate obstacles and changes in direction. His military training was evident in the smooth efficiency of his movement, and Sarah realized she was learning combat skills in real time from someone who had been forced to become a teacher by circumstances. As they got closer to the enemy position, Sarah could hear individual voices and pieces of conversation in what sounded like Arabic mixed with English. The communications discipline she had observed from a distance was less evident up close, with personnel talking more freely than proper tactical protocol would recommend. This suggested confidence in their security and tactical situation, but it also provided opportunities for intelligence gathering.
Radio traffic indicates they're planning to overrun the remaining defensive positions within the next hour, Martinez whispered after listening to several exchanges.
After that, they intend to search the base for survivors and equipment. Sarah processed this information while studying the layout of the enemy position. The mortars were positioned to provide mutual support, and the ammunition was stored in reinforced bunkers that would be difficult to damage with their limited explosive devices.
But the communication equipment was more vulnerable, and disrupting enemy coordination might be more valuable than eliminating individual weapons. Change of plan, she whispered to Martinez.
We target their communications first. Without coordination, the mortars become much less effective, even if they're still functional. Martinez nodded, understanding the tactical logic immediately. They adjusted their approach to bring them closer to the command post where radio equipment and personnel were concentrated. The explosive devices Rodriguez had assembled were small but powerful, designed to damage equipment rather than create casualties. Properly placed, they could disable communication systems and create enough confusion to disrupt the coordinated assault on the base. Sarah found herself thinking about the wounded soldiers they had left in the maintenance bunker and about Dr. Gordner Peterson waiting in the water treatment facility for their return. The weight of responsibility for other people's lives was something she had carried as a nurse, but this felt different. Medical decisions affected individual patients. Tactical decisions affected everyone. As they reached the optimal position for placing their charges, Sarah realized that this moment represented the culmination of everything her unconventional upbringing had prepared her for. Her father's lessons about military strategy, her mother's training in emergency medicine, and her own experience in remaining calm under extreme pressure had all led to this point. The enemy had planned their attack based on detailed intelligence about FOB Phoenix's defensive capabilities and standard operating procedures. They had accounted for the base's firepower, personnel strength, and tactical doctrine, but they had not accounted for the possibility that a nurse would become a strategic leader, that medical personnel would conduct combat operations, or that their carefully planned assault would be countered by tactics drawn from sources they had never considered. Sarah Chen had always been underestimated because people saw her role before they saw her capabilities. Now she was about to demonstrate that the most dangerous opponent is often the one you don't take seriously. As Martinez prepared to place the first explosive charge, Sarah checked her watch and calculated timing for their withdrawal. In less than 2 minutes, the siege of Ob Phoenix would shift from a defensive struggle to something entirely different. The quiet nurse who had arrived at the base 6 weeks ago was about to change the course of a battle through the application of strategic thinking that her parents had taught her around a dinner table in suburban Oregon. The enemy was about to learn that intelligence gathering is only useful if you gather intelligence about the right people. And they had been watching the wrong people entirely. The first explosion shattered the enemy's communication equipment in a brilliant flash of sparks and twisted metal, followed immediately by shouts of confusion from personnel who had been confident in their tactical superiority just moments before. Sarah counted the seconds as she and Martinez crawled rapidly back through the drainage ditch, putting distance between themselves and the chaos they had created at the mortar position.
The second charge detonated 15 seconds later, destroying the ammunition supply for the main mortar battery and sending a pillar of smoke into the night sky that could be seen from the base. Sarah felt the shockwave through the ground beneath her, as she pressed herself flat against the muddy bottom of the ditch, waiting for the debris to stop falling around them.
"Move, move, move," Martinez whispered urgently, and they began the rapid withdrawal toward the water treatment facility. Behind them, the enemy position dissolved into confusion as personnel tried to assess damage, restore communications, and maintain their assault on FOB Phoenix simultaneously. The third explosion came not from their remaining charges but from the base itself. Rodriguez had been monitoring their progress through prearranged signals, and the destruction of enemy communications was his cue to launch coordinated counterattacks from all surviving defensive positions. Muzzle flashes erupted from buildings throughout the base as defenders emerged from concealment to engage targets that could no longer coordinate their responses effectively. Sarah and Martinez reached the water treatment facility as the tactical situation shifted dramatically around them. Dr. Peterson was waiting with the radio equipment Sarah had requested, monitoring the frequency that Rodriguez was using to coordinate the counterattack. "Phoenix 6 to all units." Rodriguez's voice came through the radio static. "Communications disruption successful. All teams execute phase 2 on my mark. 3, 2, 1, execute." What followed was a textbook example of how superior coordination could overcome numerical disadvantage. The scattered defenders of Ob Phoenix emerged from their isolated positions simultaneously, attacking enemy forces that were now blind and unable to coordinate mutual support. The carefully planned siege began to collapse as attackers found themselves fighting separate battles against opponents who knew the terrain and had regained tactical initiative. But Sarah knew the battle was far from over. The enemy still had significant personnel advantages and weapons capabilities, even without their heavy mortars and communications coordination. More importantly, they would adapt to the changed situation and attempt to regain control through more aggressive tactics. Peterson, she called over to the doctor. What's our casualty status at the base? Peterson consulted notes he had been taking during radio communications with the medical staff who had remained in the maintenance bunker. 12 confirmed wounded, ranging from minor injuries to severe trauma. 3 confirmed dead. Unknown number of additional casualties in positions we haven't been able to contact. Sarah processed these numbers while planning their next moves. 12 wounded soldiers meant 12 people who would need immediate medical attention once the tactical situation permitted evacuation. But it also meant 12 people who could potentially return to combat effectiveness if properly treated, significantly improving the base's defensive capabilities. We need to get back to the bunker and establish a proper medical facility, she decided. Rodriguez will need every available person for the final phase of this fight. Martinez looked doubtful. The route back through the tunnels will be much more dangerous now. The enemy knows there's movement underground and they'll be watching access points. Then we don't use the same route, Sarah replied, studying her mental map of the tunnel system. There's a secondary access that leads directly to the motor pool. If we can reach that building, we can provide medical support much closer to where people are actually fighting. As they prepared to move back through the tunnel system, Sarah reflected on how much her understanding of her own capabilities had changed over the past few hours. When the attack began, she had been focused on treating casualties and supporting the medical mission. Now, she was thinking in terms of tactical coordination, resource allocation, and strategic objectives that extended far beyond immediate medical care. The transformation felt natural rather than sudden, as if she had always possessed these capabilities and simply needed the right circumstances to reveal them. Her father's lessons about military strategy and her mother's training in emergency medicine had combined with her own experience in remaining calm under pressure to create something that was more effective than any of its individual components. The return journey through the tunnels was complicated by the sounds of ongoing combat above them, making it difficult to determine which routes were safe and which might lead them directly into active fighting. Sarah navigated by sound and intuition, choosing paths that kept them away from the heaviest gunfire while still moving them toward their objective. As they crawled through the narrow passages, Martinez suddenly stopped and held up a hand for silence. Through the concrete walls, they could hear voices speaking in English with American accents, but coming from a direction that should have been controlled by enemy forces. Sarah listened carefully, trying to determine whether these were friendly forces or captured personnel being moved by the enemy. The conversation was too muffled to make out individual words, but the tone suggested people who were moving purposefully rather than under duress. Sounds like Rodriguez's counterattack is making progress, Peterson whispered. They continued forward, more cautiously, emerging finally into a utility room beneath the motor pool building. The space above them echoed with the sounds of vehicles starting and equipment being moved, suggesting significant activity. Sarah climbed the access ladder carefully and opened the hatch just enough to peer into the motor pool itself. What she saw confirmed that the tactical situation had shifted dramatically in their favor. American soldiers were moving through the building systematically, checking vehicles and gathering equipment under the direction of Sergeant Williams. The enemy personnel who had been controlling this area were gone, either eliminated or withdrawn to other positions. Sergeant Williams, Sarah called softly, as she emerged from the utility hatch. Williams spun around, weapon ready, then relaxed when he recognized her. Nurse Chen, what the hell are you doing coming out of the floor? Long story, Sarah replied as Peterson and Martinez climbed up behind her. What's the current tactical situation? Williams looked surprised by the question, but answered automatically. Enemy forces are withdrawing from the eastern perimeter. Captain Rodriguez is coordinating pursuit operations to ensure they don't regroup and mount another assault. We've retaken about 60% of the base, but we're still missing personnel from several positions. Sarah processed this information while establishing priorities for their immediate actions. The medical needs were obvious, but she realized that their next decisions would determine whether this tactical victory became a strategic success. Sergeant, I need you to coordinate with Captain Rodriguez on 2 issues, she said with the authority of someone who had earned the right to give tactical advice. First, we need to establish a proper medical facility here in the motor pool to treat the wounded and return people to combat effectiveness. Second, we need to ensure that our pursuit operations don't extend beyond our ability to maintain security at the base itself. William stared at her for a moment, clearly processing the fact that a nurse was providing strategic guidance. But he had been monitoring radio communications throughout the battle and had heard enough to understand that Nurse Chen had played a crucial role in turning the tide of the fight. "I'll relay your recommendations to the captain," he said finally. "What do you need for the medical facility?" Over the next 2 hours, Sarah coordinated the establishment of the most unconventional field hospital in military history. Using vehicles from the motor pool as examination rooms, maintenance equipment as makeshift medical devices, and personnel from multiple specialties as improvised medical staff, she created a treatment facility that could handle everything from minor injuries to complex trauma surgery. Dr. Peterson supervised the medical procedures while Sarah managed logistics, resource allocation, and coordination with ongoing tactical operations. She found herself moving seamlessly between roles, treating wounded soldiers one moment and providing strategic advice to combat commanders the next. As dawn broke over Fob Phoenix, the full scope of their victory became clear. The enemy had withdrawn completely, leaving behind significant equipment and taking heavy casualties that would prevent them from mounting similar operations in the foreseeable future. More importantly, the base's defensive capabilities had been not just preserved but actually improved through the lessons learned during the siege. Captain Rodriguez found Sarah in the motor pool medical facility as she was completing surgery on the soldier with the compound leg fracture, the same patient she had been treating when the attack began. 6 months later, Sarah Chen received a commendation for her role in the defense of FOB Phoenix, recognizing her contributions to both medical care and tactical operations. The citation noted that her innovative thinking and leadership under extreme pressure had been instrumental in preventing the loss of the base and minimizing casualties among personnel. But the formal recognition was less important to Sarah than the knowledge that she had discovered capabilities within herself that she had never fully realized existed. The quiet nurse who had arrived at FOB Phoenix with 2 duffel bags and unnoticed determination had become someone who could provide strategic leadership when circumstances demanded it. More importantly, she had proven that the most dangerous assumption in any conflict is believing that you fully understand your opponents based on their apparent roles or obvious characteristics. The enemy had conducted detailed intelligence gathering about FOB Phoenix's military capabilities. But they had completely missed the most important intelligence of all: the character and determination of the people they had chosen to attack. Sarah Chen had always been more than just a nurse, but it took an enemy siege to reveal that truth to the world. In the end, the most powerful weapon in the defense of FOB Phoenix had not been superior firepower or tactical doctrine, but the refusal of ordinary people to be limited by other people's assumptions about what they could accomplish. The battle had been won not by following the rules of engagement that everyone expected, but by rewriting those rules entirely. And that lesson, Sarah knew, would serve her well in whatever challenges lay ahead, in a world where the most important victories often came from the most unexpected sources.